This is the Reading League Vermont's fourth presentation of our Writing is Thinking series. And we're so glad to have you here today to hear Dr. Margie Gillis and Nancy Eberhardt talk about syntax today. I was just telling them the last time I heard them speak, or the first time I heard them speak was 10 years ago. So this is something they've been doing for quite some time, and they're my favorite speakers when it comes to listening about syntax. I'm Brenda Warren, president of the Reading League Vermont. And before I introduce our speakers, I will ask, they have asked that if you can put in your location and your role as it relates to writing instruction, then that gives them a sense of who's listening and how to target some of their comments. And then after you do that, I would request that you use the chat only for questions. That just helps us see them more easily at the end. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Margie Gillis. She's the founder and president of Literacy How, Inc. This nonprofit organization provides professional learning opportunities and coaching for educators on implementing research-based practices in the classroom. Dr. Gillis spent 25 years teaching individuals with dyslexia of all ages learn to read, preparing her to shift gears to bring the research on reading and structured literacy into district schools and, importantly, classrooms across all tiers of instruction. Dr. Gillis believes that learning to read is a civil right and that all children benefit from well-informed instruction. Nancy Eberhardt is an educational consultant with extensive experience as a resource teacher, special education administrator, and professional development provider. She has co-authored several literacy materials, including Sortigories with Cheryl Ferlito, Language, the Comprehensive Literacy Curriculum with Jane Fell Green, and the Literacy How Professional Learning Series with Margie Gillis. She is currently a consultant with the 95% Group, Literacy How, and the Reading Universe Taxonomy Project. She serves as co-editor-in-chief for IDA's Perspectives on Language and Literacy. Nancy is a strong advocate for preventing reading underachievement by supporting teachers with professional development and evidence-based resources. And today, Margie and Nancy will be presenting Let's Talk Syntax Instruction for Writing. So I'll take it away.
Thank you very much, Brenda. And so nice to see you all from all over the place. I was expecting a lot of Vermont people, but I see Texas, I see somebody from Dublin, which is awesome, Mississippi, Massachusetts, New York, primary teachers, I see literacy coaches, tutors, a whole host of people. So we will be speaking to a broad audience, it sounds like, and that's usually what we do. And you'll see the agenda coming up in a moment. As Brenda said, I'm Margie Gillis, and I've been working with teachers through Literacy How, primarily in Connecticut, but I've worked in other states as well, and really just translating the research for them in their classrooms, vis-a-vis our team of mentors who actually provide embedded professional development, because I think coaching is really the best way to get transfer. So we're happy to see you today, and Nancy's going to tell you our agenda for this morning.
Absolutely. And just a quick question, are the pictures of people blocking things for you all on the screen?
Not for me.
Okay, good. Then things are working. Yay. Thank you, Margie. And I had the opportunity to listen in last week to the 3 other sessions in this series, which were really an impressive series of speakers. And notable in each of them was the passing reference to sentence writing. And I think that maybe they were hoping that that's what Margie and I were going to do today. But what was interesting to me is that our analogy is that to write or do any of the processes that Leslie Loud or Kay or Steve Graham mentioned, we need those building blocks of writing, which are the sentences. So we are hoping to fill that information gap today. So We want to start by positioning syntax in some of the writing models. And then we are going to launch into a distinction between function first, label later, as opposed to conventional instruction, and why we've gone in that direction over the years, probably many more than 10 years, on trying to move our study of syntax in this direction. We're going to spend a few minutes on the grammatical building blocks because in our mind, that is the equivalent of teaching sound to spelling correspondences, so we can't really talk sentences without them. But we really want to put all of this together in the context of activities that are either evidence-based or help to systematically build out students' ability to write sentences, meaningful sentences. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Margie, who's going to get us started. Oops.
Thank you, Nancy.
You're welcome.
So I think most of you are familiar with the simple view of reading. That is that reading comprehension is the product of language comprehension and word recognition. But maybe some of you have not heard of the simple view of writing, which was proposed by Berninger and Amptman in 2003. And this slide shows 3 factors that contribute to written expression. First is the translation or transcription, rather. And transcription involves handwriting and spelling and mechanics. The second big important component of writing is ideation or text generation. So turning those ideas into text, as the slide shows. And then the third aspect of writing is referred to in many different ways, might be process writing, it might be called self-regulation, executive function, etc. So you see those 3 components. And then in the middle, you see constrained by attention and memory. So if you go to the next slide, you see another version of this triangle, which is really basically showing that it's not so simple. It's not so simple even without what we inserted or what Dr. Berninger inserted in the middle or the center of the triangle. And that is that working memory is going to constrain, working memory and attention is going to constrain the writer's ability to put all these things together. So just positioning, as Nancy said, where does syntax fit in? Another model that we at Literacy How developed a number of years ago, actually 2010 to be exact, was to, again, think about those 3 big components. On the left, you see the writing process, which is often involving executive function skills. Then you see the translation, which we divided into text generation, which was on that triangle, and on the other side, transcription. And then you see underneath text generation, 3 levels of writing. So when we're coming up with our ideas, we first have to think about the words that we're going to put into sentences. We have to think about putting those words into a sentence that makes sense. And that's what we're going to talk about today. That's why we highlighted syntax. And then you have the discourse level. But in order to get to that discourse level, we need to spend a lot of time helping students generate these sentences, understand how sentences work. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Just quickly, you'll also notice we have 2 stars, language comprehension, that is hovering over text generation, and word recognition that is hovering over transcription, and then bubbles. Okay, so when you get the slides later, you can dissect this. I don't want to spend any more time doing that, but I just wanted you to see the big picture and where syntax is situated in writing. And Nancy and I wrote a series, professional learning series for Literacy How, for the work that we do with teachers, and one of them is devoted to syntax. And while we spend a lot of time in this book building teachers' knowledge about syntax and its role in reading comprehension, we certainly represent and recognize, I guess is the better word, how important syntax is for writing. And as it says here, research confirms students' ability to write complex sentences actually also improves their reading comprehension. So they're reciprocal skills. We put text comprehension and written expression in the same section of the wheel, but you'll also notice syntax has its own place, which actually took the place of fluency. Another conversation for another day, but take it away, Nancy.
Okay. So what is syntax? And we like this definition, this explanation that syntax is that domain of language that has to do with the arrangement of words, phrases, and clauses into sentences. And what's important in that definition that we'll be hopefully building upon through the rest of this session is that it's not just that we arrange words, that in fact we want to drive students in their writing of sentences to see that sometimes a phrase and sometimes a clause is contributing a certain kind of information to the sentence. And as we drive or help students to understand that, we're helping them write more comprehensible sentences. More about that in a moment. And that certainly syntactic knowledge is a contributor not only to the comprehension of text, but also for students to write text that is comprehensible to the reader. Now, about 20 years ago, and I know this is too small to read, but I wanted you to see the whole thing because my favorite thing in this meta-analysis that Dr. Graham did 20 years ago, along with others, called Writing Next, was they had a note about grammar. And this always cracked me up because it was just a little box. And in that box was, however, a very critical statement, two statements. Mostly people focused on the first one with the first arrow, and then I'd like to point out the second arrow. So I'm going to go to the next slide where I expand this so you can see it. The first arrow said that traditional grammar instruction is unlikely to improve the quality of students' writing. And for some people, that's all they had to read to stop ever thinking they had to teach grammar because it wasn't going to help. However, later in that same paragraph, as I just showed you, was a recent study found, and it goes on to say that an emphasis on functionality and the purpose of the role of words did contribute to the students' writing. And it's not for that reason, but in support of what we're going to say, that this is really why we're emphasizing for the duration of this session that we're going to work on what does it mean to focus on function as we teach syntax, as opposed to what we would call the traditional terminology and grammar. So with that aside, what does function first mean and then label later? In each of these three sentences, we have a part that I've highlighted in green. And I'd like for you to think for a second, what information, what question does do yesterday at dusk and as the sunlight faded? What question is that answering? I'm hoping that you're saying it's answering, whoops, I keep hitting the wrong thing here. It's answering the question, when? And that is what we mean by function. What is the purpose? What is the information? What is the meaning that the word, phrase, or clause is doing? And once students or anyone can identify that, then moving to traditional labeling, we can call those words that tell us when adverbs or adverbial phrase or adverbial clause. But the point of this is that these are working in a similar way within the sentence in terms of function, and that is an important message that we're trying to convey today. So we think we should take a moment to run through the 8 grammatical building blocks because this is the equivalent of going through the sound to spelling correspondences for decoding. And we only have 8, which is remarkable when we think that this is it in all the words in every book that we ever have. So one set of the building blocks has to do with naming the things in our world, be it concrete things or abstract things. So we have nouns, words that tell more about those adjectives, and words that replace the nouns, which are our pronouns. A second set of the building blocks are verbs and adverbs. And these are the words that, for the most part, tell us actions and tell us more about the actions. And then the last three, two of them have a really important job, which is to show relationships between words that we put together in sentences. And they have really, they're little words, but they have an outsized job in terms of their role. And then last but not least, we have interjections. So let's take a real quick look at each of these building blocks with an eye to what question, what meaning-based question or role do each of these parts or blocks have in our language. So nouns answer who or what. And that's an essential ingredient because that is a critical component to build a sentence. So who or what, the gardener, who or what, cactus. Then the verbs answer a question, did what, or a small number of them answer is what. So we have the plant grew. What did it do? It grew. Or the cactus is a desert plant. What is it? Those two things are being equated. Adjectives answer three questions and only three, or do I have that? Yes, adjectives. How many, what kind, and which one? And you can see how those play out in the example sentence. So when we are adding information to a sentence to tell us more about the nouns, those are the three questions that we answer. And then the last of the meaning question parts of the grammatical building blocks are adverbs, and those answer the questions where, when, how, and why. And you can see how those look in the sample sentence. So these four grammatical building blocks have a function of answering meaning-based questions. And when we drive or encourage students to think in terms of either the word, phrase, or clause that answers the question, the whole process of talking about the parts of speech, if you will, become more purposeful and meaningful. The other building blocks, instead of answering a question, they have a role. And in the case of both prepositions and pronouns, the role is to make connections, to show relationships. So in the case of prepositions, the preposition is showing a relationship between one word, a noun or verb, and the noun that ends the prepositional phrase. And so in the case of our example, the cactus is by the house. That is showing us a position relative between the cactus and the house. Pronouns, on the other hand, have a really super important role, and we're going to see more about this a little bit later, which is they replace nouns. And one of the jobs we'll often say, well, what does that refer to? What does that pronoun refer to? And understanding that is one of the key components of text cohesion. Whether we're reading or writing, we need to be linking these ideas together using the pronouns correctly. And then the next group are conjunctions. And for today and right now, we're just using the coordinating conjunctions. They are words that join words, phrases, clauses. There is another group of conjunctions called subordinating conjunctions, which are critical to our development of complex sentences where we have dependent clauses. We don't have time to go there today, but that, just so you know, this is not a complete list of all the conjunctions. And then last but not least, we have interjections, which are what we call the sort of spice of our language. And with this information, with this understanding, what we can do is help students take a core sentence and do something that we call expansions, which is what we're going to look at next. And unfortunately and strategically, some of this stuff is over my over the things on the screen are covering words, so I'm hoping I can do this. So sentence expansion is where we take a simple sentence that is composed of a who or what and a did what, and there is a sentence right there. The dogs posed, and we can systematically, gradually have students answer a question, and in this case, about the picture that expands that sentence. So, for example, we could say where, and we can see where they are sitting in the yard. By the way, I just want to point out the dog in the back right is my dog. He was at daycare and they took this picture. I just thought it was priceless. How, and you can see that they are I can't see what the word is.
Posing attentively.
Attentively, yes. Yes. By the way, the attentiveness had to do with the fact that the person taking the picture was holding a rotisserie chicken, just to put this in context. And then when on cue, how many, 5, what kind, and you can see the answers. And when we have expanded, we can put all that together and build a more expanded and more detailed sentence. Now, just to be clear, we don't ask kids to provide all that information all at once. We teach systematically what kind of information answers where, and we work on that for a while, and so on. But the process allows students to expand their language. We can do this with a more serious content than my dog at doggy daycare, and that would be to use a historical image. And we decided, since we're talking to Vermonters, well, maybe more than Vermonters, we would do something from Vermont, which is the Battle of Bennington. So if you're teaching science or social studies, you can take something, an image from your content, and do the same process. So we can say American troops, and we can answer each of the questions in the same way that I did with the dogs, and then we can put them together. We also, when we are taking those expansions and putting them together into the sentence, we have a wonderful opportunity to have students experiment with the arrangement. Should I have said in Saratoga at the beginning instead of in the year that it happened? We can discuss which one sounds better. Why would you like one versus the other? And that kind of flexibility and attention to the meaning that's created by the arrangement of these expansions, if you will, helps to build comprehension of what we're writing. And obviously, we hope and expect that it will also impact what we're reading. In my work, and Margie, actually, we're both involved with the reading universe. And while they have been doing a lot of work for years on the word reading side of things, they also have built out a tremendous set of resources for writing. And this one I wanted to share, and the QR code will take you to this location on the reading universe. But this is a way that they are helping to structure the activity that I was just describing on sentence expansion. So they give you the kernel sentence at the beginning, and then students can systematically add and then combine all of the expansion information into a sentence. So they have this activity on the website and a whole lot more resources for you. So, Margie.
All right. Thank you, Nancy. I realized, Nancy, that we did not include our slide of the 4 sentence types, which is most of you, I don't know how we missed that, but we can include that in our PowerPoint handout that we send. But essentially, we're talking about 4 structures that we would teach systematically, beginning with a simple sentence. So Nancy just showed you a kernel sentence, the dogs posed, and then we expanded it, but it was still a simple sentence, right? Since a simple sentence has 1 independent clause, and that would be the sentence that we would teach first, followed by a compound sentence that has a coordinating conjunction with 2 independent clauses. And then Nancy referred to complex sentences that have a subordinating conjunction and a dependent clause. So we can show you that later. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with that, but a lot of people ask us about a scope and sequence when we teach syntax. And part of the scope and sequence is also teaching these 4 functions and the punctuation marks that are used in these types of sentences. And the reason being that most of you are working with kids, and I'm sure you see this all the time, where kids read right through the punctuation marks and they miss prosody, they miss meaning, they miss all sorts of things, that those punctuation marks are so vitally important. And so we explicitly teach first the period and the function of that period, just like we have the function of the grammatical building blocks. Each of these punctuation marks has a very important function, and we explicitly teach them in the context of the sentence. So we have the period, right? We have the question mark. Our voices rise, and we practice that, and we read sentences with prosody using those punctuation marks as signals to the reader. The exclamation point, and then of course the comma that is, always missed. So again, explicit instruction in that those commas are really important. Again, little sidebar, when we have those clauses and when we teach those complex sentences. So it's really important that our students understand the role that they serve. And then we also teach them the 4 different functions of the sentences. So we have the declarative state sentence. We're not going to call it a declarative sentence initially. We're just going to say it states something simple. The waves crashed. And then when we get to the interrogative sentence, what is its function? It asks a question. What is a tsunami? And again, focusing on the rising of the voice, a command, right? An imperative sentence is a command, describe a tsunami, and last but not least, the exclamatory sentence that exclaims or shows surprise. Watch out for that wave. And again, this also contributes to prosody, not the topic of today's talk, but we are going to be talking about prosody in another TRL presentation, because it's an important part of syntax, right? It's where we can get our students and our teachers to think about the role that phrases and clauses play in making meaning.
And not to go down a different rabbit hole, but just to point out that one of the things we're also finding is that those students who do not adhere to, pay attention to punctuation, don't get it and pick up on that, are often our DLD, the language disabled students. They're not getting the meaning and the impact of some of these cues that our language uses. So
thanks for saying that, Nancy. And again, why we put syntax in lieu of fluency, not to say that reading fluency isn't important, but just to take a little different spin on that. So as we talk about sentence writing, and you've seen us, demonstrate the use of these function-based questions, those questions provide a metacognitive dimension to unpack the meaning of text and also to expand sentences. This is also really effective when we're getting our students to write these sentences. So we can ask these same questions as they're expanding their sentences in writing. And so here's an activity that is very effective at helping students start to write this sentence, because it scaffolds the process for them. So in this case, we used a read works passage called Frozen Home. And so the kids read the passage, and then we would say, okay, let's look for the who did what to whom, right? So that's the frame for this. And so you would put the words on index cards, and you would have the kids sort the words into the appropriate column. The who or what or the subject of the sentence would go in the first column. The did what or the action words would go in the second column. Those are the predicates. So researchers explored, and then to whom or what. So the objects, direct or indirect objects, go into the last column. And in this case, they're all lined up, but they may not be. So what we would have the students do is first go to the pocket chart where they sorted and pull from one word from each column that would make sense. And then orally, they would produce the sentence. Researchers explored 2 icebergs. And then other children would come up and do the same thing. Really important that they're doing this orally first. It's a great rehearsal for them to then take the words and write them in a sentence with the capital letter at the beginning and the punctuation mark at the end. Another really effective strategy, an activity that our students really love, it's very engaging, is called Sentence Scramble, otherwise known as anagrams. And this perspectives issue that we'll talk about later, the winter issue of 2025 that was devoted to syntax, that was a 2-part series. This article by Deacon et al. Actually cited a study that they conducted with 3rd grade students that demonstrated that students' ability to rearrange the words and phrases in a correct order actually determined the progress that they made in reading comprehension. That's such an incredible aha for so many teachers to think, wow, like if we don't teach those sentences explicitly, we're missing an opportunity to support their comprehension of the text. So we're going to show you what this looks like. Dr. Laud, I think, used this article in her talk last week, Save as Many Penguins as We Can. And we took a sentence from that text and we put the words on little index cards. This is how it works, right? And arrange the words. And then we'll start this process by asking students a series of questions. First question is, what is the action? And that is always the first question. So when you're selecting your sentences from your text, and it can be any text your kids are reading, make sure that you select a sentence that only has one verb. Otherwise, you're going to get into a trouble, like ranging the words and having 2 clauses, or you might have a compound predicate. And that just makes it a little more challenging. So begin with sentences with just one verb. So if I ask the students, what is the action? They should say endangered. Then the next question would be, who or what did the action? So now we're going to have the kids look for who endangered, and or what. In this case, it's a what. And the answer is tons endangered. Okay, let's continue. The next question would be, which tons endangered? And the answer is tons of oil. Kind of awkward, but tons of oil endangered. The kids would get this because they would have read this passage. Now, the next question, because we have the subject and the predicate, is to whom or what did the tons of oil endanger? And of course, the answer is penguins. Tons of oil endangered penguins. And where did this happen? It happened along the coast. And then you have your complete sentence. Tons of oil endangered penguins along the coast. You can have the kids write the sentence after they've unscrambled it. But again, it's a very effective strategy for getting them to answer these questions along the way and then write the sentences. Another activity that we've used very successfully, and it's actually one that Graham and Perrin talk about in the work that they've done. They talk about it in the Writing Next meta-analysis that Nancy shared earlier, and they continue to talk about it, as do other people, when they talk about syntax. And the first quote, that the findings suggest that although teaching grammar is important, alternative procedures are more effective than traditional approaches. And one of those procedures is, guess what? Sentence combining, right? So we keep saying it's a function-based approach. And sentence combining really lends itself very nicely to focusing on the function of these words in the sentence. So as the quote says, sentence combining involves teaching the students to construct more complex and sophisticated sentences by beginning with two simple sentences, right? And then combining those into a single sentence. Teaching adolescents how to write increasingly complex sentences enhances the quality of the writing. Well, that's true for adolescents, but we believe it also helps our young students too. And we're going to share more about this strategy, this activity, and why it's so important and effective. And I'm sure that some of your presenters talked about the IES practice guides. This is a screenshot from the IES practice guide on writing. It's an excellent practice guide. If you haven't seen it and you haven't had a chance to download it, Brenda, I don't know if your participants have this or not, but this would be another great PDF to put in the chat at some point. And if you click one more time, there you go. This is the title. No, you're good. This is the title of the practice guide. And this specific practice guide, as all of them do, have very practical, they're practice guides, practical activities that you can do in your classrooms. And they're pretty explicit at describing the activity. So if you look at the right-hand column, as it says, you're going to choose sentences for combining. We're going to show you a resource that chooses the sentences for you. But one other way to do this is to get a lot of kids, when they write, are famous for writing sentences that are the same, formulaic structure, and they're simple sentences, and they repeat the subject or the name, and they keep repeating it versus using pronouns. So we're going to show you an example in a minute from Reading Universe, but the first step would be to combine with conjunctions, and it really shows you how to model this activity, the practice guide, and also this syntax project. So you're going to start by using a coordinating conjunction, in this case, the word and, to create compound parts. It shows you the dog sat, the cat sat, and very simple, the dog and the cat sat. You would, of course, change the uppercase T in the second part of this to a lowercase t, but you do this on a pocket chart. The kids pull the coordinating conjunction and replace the verb in the first sentence.
So we thought we would take advantage of our access to some really wonderful material from the Reading Universe on writing. And this particular video is in a sequence. You can see it says part 2. The teachers already talked about the coordinating conjunctions and what each means. So in this case, we're going to watch just a few minutes so you get a flavor for this resource and that there is a sequence of explicit instruction going on. First, we do have to establish that the students understand the meaning of the conjunctions. Now it's getting applied, as you'll see with this particular video.
So what we're going to do is we're going to try to put our conjunction knowledge to the test. We're going to try to choose a conjunction, a connector word that connects some simple sentences. But we really have to think about which one are we using? Are we combining two ideas that are similar and related? Are we showing that two ideas are different than each other?
Conjunctions help young writers connect ideas or combine sentences in a meaningful way. These third grade students in Heather Adams' class have already learned 4 essential conjunctions: and, but, or, and so. Now she's giving them a chance to practice choosing the right one, first as a class, then on their own.
We've been reading Matilda, and we're not quite finished yet, but we've gotten to know the main character, Matilda, and we know a lot about her.
You'll notice Miss Adams provides pre-written short sentences on a topic that her students are familiar with. This lets them focus on just the task at hand, picking the correct conjunction.
Here are 2 simple sentences about Matilda from our read aloud. Matilda reads at the library. Yeah. We know that to be true. Matilda reads in her bedroom. Now we know Matilda would read just about anywhere, right? But we want to think about, are these two ideas related in a certain way? Matilda reads at the library. Matilda reads in her bedroom. Which of our conjunctions, which of our connecting words would make sense if we wanted to combine these two simple sentences into a really sophisticated compound sentence? Which one, London?
And.
And, exactly. And London, why did you choose and as your connector word, your conjunction?
Because it's kind of related.
Right, these ideas are related. They're both about
Reading.
They're both about Matilda reading in different places. Exactly. Are you ready for another one?
Yes.
I think you're going to like this one. Mr. Wormwood is mean to Matilda. Matilda plays pranks on Mr. Wormwood. Oh, and which conjunction are you thinking makes sense here?
So, because it's kind of like cause and effect.
Right. What's the cause here, Owen?
Mr. Wormwood is mean to Matilda, so Matilda plays pranks on Mr. Wormwood.
Yeah, if he wasn't mean, she wouldn't have played those pranks, right? I agree. When we want to show cause and effect, we want to use the connector word, the conjunction so. If I put that together as one complete sentence, it might sound like this. Mr. Wormwood is mean to Matilda, so Matilda plays pranks on Mr. Wormwood. I almost want to make another little change. Tell me what you think about this. Mr. Wormwood is mean to Matilda, so she plays pranks on Mr. Wormwood. Or she plays pranks on him. That's what I was thinking. Sometimes when we do sentence combining, we might want to take out some words if they're a little repetitive. And that's something that you can choose to do as this sort of like writer artist. So now it's
We could continue to watch that, but we wouldn't get through our presentation if we do. So I need to just get back to my PowerPoint. Let's see, how do I do that?
While you're doing that, Nancy, I'll just you're good. You'll get there.
I will. There we go.
There you go. This whole idea of sentence combining and this teacher who's just wonderful, she exudes enthusiasm and just engaging the kids, is so effective at showing how this process works. And in this case, you probably note that we had a fanboy. So we have the fanboys are 7 words that are coordinating conjunctions, and the children had to select one of those that made sense. And but not only did we do that, we also replaced the nouns, right? The proper nouns with the pronouns. And that's also something that you can add into this whole process of sentence combining. So I mentioned a few minutes. Oh, go ahead, Nancy. You were going to say something.
The only other thing I wanted to mention, because we're asked this all the time, which is, when do I do this? How do I add this instruction, syntax instruction, to my coursework or my classwork? And I think this is a beautiful example of, they're reading a novel, and she's using an opportunity to take some sentences from that. And also she's getting at comprehension. They're talking about writing based on something they're already doing. So I think that it's a much more integrated process when we think about a scope and sequence for teaching syntax. So anyway.
Exactly. And yeah, so a wonderful resource. And in a bit, we'll share a resource that has lots of great practical stuff that you can use in your classrooms. But just to add more to the sentence combining repertoire that we've been talking about, is something called Syntax Project, which I'm sure one of our facilitators here, Brenda or Lee, I think, will put a link to this wonderful resource in the chat. And this is very scaffolded for students, because sentence combining is great. And for some kids, you can just explain it once and they're off and running. But for the most part, this has to be taught very explicitly and with sentences, right? Could be from their from their text that they're reading, or in this case, this is already done for you. These are PowerPoint presentations. They're labeled by grade level. And again, they're very systematic and sequential in how they teach this process. The one criticism we had for this is that they focus on the labels. So you'll see here, they talk about simple sentences, they talk about independent clauses, coordinating conjunctions. You know, ultimately, we want our students to know those labels, but when you're introducing syntax to them, it really does have to focus heavily on the function. So you can see here the two sentences that you're combining, that lava spewed out of the crater of the volcano, and then it flowed down the hillside. And we're combining those, and there's a process by identifying and circling the subject. You could say circle the namer in the first sentence. You can circle the action word or the pronoun. Just use the function as you do this, and then you get your combined sentence. If you go back one more time, go back one for just a second, Nancy, to the prior slide. I just want to point out that one of the nice things about this syntax.
I'm afraid I'm going to lose it if I do. Just sorry.
Okay, then no worries. On the prior slide, I just wanted to point out that what you would see is in the lower right-hand corner, there was a box that showed a capital I and two capital I's, which stood for the independent clauses with the fanboys in between. And it's just they've just designed this so nicely for teaching this explicitly and having all the things on the slides that the kids need to use as a reference. So the next slide shows, again, the same idea, but this one is, as you can imagine, later in the sequence, because now we're teaching about relative clauses. And it's really important that we teach relative clauses because they're everywhere in the student's text. And you can see the boxes have the relative adverbs, and then another box has the relative pronouns, and check for understanding box that says what is the subject being described, which relative pronoun, etc. Again, Nancy and I love what they've done, but I would propose that you think about emphasizing that function first and those questions that we've been talking about throughout our presentation. And another resource that many of you are familiar with is The Writing Revolution, the book that was co-written by Judy Hochman and Natalie Wexler, now in its second edition. And one of the quotes that we just always reference, because it's so right on, is the fact that when we have kids summarizing and expanding sentences, they demand similar skills, which is basically figuring out what's most important in a body of information, and then what details support that main idea, how those details relate to one another. Our kids, especially our kids that often struggle with finding the main idea or summarizing things. So again, this is a great way to scaffold their ability to do that. This sentence summary activity was developed by Judy and Natalie Wexler, and you see it in their book, and it's used pervasively. After they've done, figuring out the who did what, the when, where, why, then they do a sentence summary, which would summarize an entire paragraph, possibly, or a sentence. And then the next slide shows.
Whoops, I can't. I've got to go back there. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. The next slide just shows another version of this idea of writing a summary, again, through this questioning strategy. And what you're doing here, and it's called Get the Gist. This comes from Collaborative Strategic Reading by Sharon Vaughn and her colleagues, which has been around for a very long time. You can find these resources online too that have templates that, again, scaffold and provide a structure for the students who need that kind of structure. And in this case, they're first finding the most important who or what, and then they're finding the information about the who or what. And that is, in this case, answering those questions: when, where, why, and what happened. And then once they go through that, put that information in the template that you see here, then they're going to write a brief just statement. Sometimes hard to do. We say 10 words or less. But if you have a sentence that has lots of information and details, that's a little more challenging, but you get the idea. It's writing these just statements, writing these summaries, that it's a very effective strategy for bringing students awareness about what's most important in the text that they read.
And to wrap up, one more idea that we want to set forth is that writing individual sentences is not the same as text. And so one of the other ideas that we need to develop is that if we take this pattern of who did what to whom, or conventionally subject, predicate, direct object, and write a series of sentences in that pattern, not only do we want to write those sentences with the correct components, but we also need to use some techniques, and we call them cohesive ties or cohesive devices, to connect between the sentences so that they relate. And this goes back to our earlier comment about what is the role of pronouns. Well, they replace, and we can use them to refer back. And that in and of itself is a skill that we have to teach explicitly. So one of the tools that we like for this was provided by Haynes and Jennings in their book From Speaking to Writing. And it's the cohesion circle mnemonic, where they propose taking the original noun, having students generate before they write synonyms for that noun, listing the pronouns that would be appropriate, and then more synonyms. And then when they go to write, they can, in fact, employ those predetermined information, the noun, the synonyms, and pronouns, to write their paragraph. And that's what we're illustrating here, that this is a very deliberate process, very similar to what we saw Heather Adams doing back with the conjunctions, that this is a conversation about how we can improve our writing by changing the words that we use. We just don't keep saying plants, plants, plants. So that is the basic information. Marge, you want to go through these resources or no? Yes? Can't hear you.
Sorry, I muted myself. These are some references of some of the things that we shared with you this morning. You can go to the next slide. And then on this slide here, we have a wonderful, we will be sending you a PDF. Brenda, I did text it to you, so I don't know if you want to grab it from your text and put it in the chat. But this is, I think, a 7-page handout that was part of a series, a 2-issue series that I referenced earlier from Perspectives, IDA's publication. The 2-part series has wonderful articles in it, but in issue 2, we had this guide to syntax and language comprehension resources focused on text comprehension and language comprehension, but certainly there's a lot in there too that will be useful for you as you teach your students more about writing based on the summer series that Vermont has so generously offered. So we'll make sure you get the slides, and we'll make sure you get that resource guide. And then on this slide, we have a course that we have written that goes along with the syntax book that we showed you earlier, that goes into depth on what is syntax, how to teach it, our big ideas associated with syntax that we alluded to today. And I think Brenda put that in earlier, but I will say that, Brenda, when you put the link to the Literacy House syntax course, and you'll see that there, It's not part of the syntax project. Syntax project is another resource, and it's awesome. And so we'll make sure that you get that as well. So as we wrap up here, I do see a question from Chantel, and it's a really good one, and it's something that we both talked a little bit about, and that is, do we have a recommended scope and sequence? And do we have a recommended scope and sequence? Well, we alluded to that. Do we have an exact scope and sequence? I would say a couple things, and Nancy, chime in here. We usually start with the namers and the actions, because that's the who or what did what, right? So we're going to explicitly teach namers and the role that they serve. We call them namers for little kids because they name the person, place, or thing. Noun is a very abstract term, but namers tells the function. And then action is a verb, so it's an action word. And so we have to teach those two first, and we have to teach that every sentence has one of each, at least one of each. That's your kernel sentence. Then we talk about namer, tell me more. And that's where we get into adjectives, and action, tell me more. That's where we get into adverbs. So those are the four grammatical building blocks that we would start with. And we would make sure kids can build sentences with those four, because those are really important. And then we would add on those other four. We would teach the simple sentence first, as I mentioned earlier. And then the next sentence that we would teach would be the compound sentence, because there's only 7 coordinating conjunctions, those fanboys. And so we want to make sure they understand the concept of an independent clause. So that's a concept you have to teach right away. And then you also have to teach the concept of a phrase, right? Because an adjective, as Nancy showed, actually she showed you the adverb. An adverb can be a single word, right? Or it could be a phrase, an adverbial phrase, or it can be an adverbial clause. So that concept of, we think of adverbs as always ending in ly. That's not true. Certainly some do, but there are plenty that don't. And there are lots of adverbial phrases. And so that idea of a phrase, 2 or more words that go together, right, to make meaning. I hope that answers your question, Chantel, and add some information to that, Nancy.
Yeah, no, and I was just going to say, and I think if we keep driving back to does the word, phrase, or clause, even if the students can't differentiate those terms, are answering a question, we're really emphasizing meaning making for them when they're writing. Going back and deciding is it a phrase or a clause is not the most important part. What is important is that those answers can be more than one word. And I think that is what is so important about this function-based, meaning-based approach to syntax, whether it's for writing or comprehension.
Yeah, exactly. And Raina asked about a resource for older students. As I mentioned, the syntax course, we tried to make it relevant for all students. And, our content, would probably fit best for K-5 in general, but we know and we recognize that so many of our adolescents do not have a good command of syntax and sentence writing, sentence comprehension. So I think it can be useful for them too, and we've gotten good feedback on that front. So thanks for asking the question, Raina.
And keep in mind for older kids, I'm speaking for writing the language intervention curriculum, which was targeted for older students who hadn't learned any of this early in the earlier grades, is that what we're talking about is exactly the same whether you're 6 or 16. And what is nice about it, and I think we've illustrated this in several ways, including the video, is this can also be drawn from the text material, that subject material that the students are having to navigate and deal with anyway. So I think understanding the concept you're trying to teach and drawing on their subject matter is really beneficial for the students in terms of both teaching the content as well as improving their writing.
Exactly.
All right.
Well, I know it's 11 o'clock,
Yes.
so here we are, Brenda. Take it away.
Perfect. I just want to thank everyone again. I put some notes in the chat about resources on our Reading League Vermont website that might be helpful to you as you continue looking at writing and how to improve writing instruction. Thanks again, everyone, for coming. And this will be the conclusion of our webinar series on Writing is Thinking. And thank you, Margie and Nancy, so much for your time this morning and giving us the basics of how to teach good sentence writing.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Lee, for your help.
Thank you to everyone for coming.
Yes.